The zombies are coming.
As a big fan of all things zombie related, I decided to build a diorama as a small homage to AMC's Walking Dead television franchise. I wanted to create an action scene which featured a whole bunch of creepy zombies. And here's how I did it. Hi there, and thank you for joining us on our channel. I started off by building a whole bunch of zombies. For some strange reason, the resin ones were mostly purple.
It was a one-eyed, one-horn, flying purple people eater. One-eyed, one-horn, flying purple people eater. Sure looks strange to me.
And I didn't seem to have enough zombies for the diorama. So what I did was, I converted some of those German and Russian soldiers into homemade zombies as well. These zombies all received a black primer coat and a zenithal highlight from above. Once this was done, I saw there were a few mold lines that needed to be taken care of, so I scraped these off as well before continuing. I painted on the first base layer, blocking in all the primary colors of the zombies. This was followed by a red and brown wash, and then I just picked out the various highlighted areas. The next step was to build the motorcycle. It was a little bit challenging because it was a master box kit, and master box are notorious for not numbering the parts on the sprues. I had to constantly refer back to a diagram with the parts numbers and compare them to the various parts on the sprues. But besides that minor annoyance, the motorcycle came together quite nicely. While I was building it, I had to add in the electronics as well. The headlight needed to get a steady LED, and the machine gun needed to get a red LED. I carefully drilled the holes for the motorcycle and used some UV resin to seal the LED into the part. For the machine gun, I soldered up a red LED and then drilled a hole into the sidecar. I passed the wire through and glued up the two parts. The whole motorcycle received a base coat of dark brown, and then I sponged on some dark green to make it look like a bit of a rusty effect. I have to admit the motorcycle looked really cute once it was finished. I needed to create a building for a bit of interest in the background. I carefully planned out the building and drew in the windows and doors in a scale which fit with the figures. To create the bricks I used some foam board. The only trick with a foam board is that it has a paper layer which needs to be removed before one can shape out the bricks. I started creating all of the bricks, but only once I had them all painted up and looking good, I realized that the scale was totally wrong for the zombies. So I had to do another set, this time with much smaller bricks to fit with the scale of the diorama. I applied a base coat of dark grey, and this was followed by a coat of light brown. I then used random light and dark brown colors all over the bricks to make them look a bit more natural. Once the bricks were all painted up, I cut out all the doors and windows. I decided to glue this part to a backplate and do all the details of the doors and windows on this backplate. At first I gave the areas where the doors were a coat of dark brown, just to simulate a bit of rust, and sponged on a bit of dark blue and some white for variation. I constantly test fitted the front part of the building to this backplate to make sure that everything matched up nicely. I then scratch built the windows and door frames and painted them with a deck tan color, which was a good way to simulate old concrete. I dirtied up these parts to make it look more like an abandoned building. Once all the paint was dry, I glued the front part of the building to the backplate using some white glue and let it dry overnight. All of the windows and door panels were added once everything was dry. Using the same white glue, I glued a piece of foam board onto the wooden base of the diorama. My first idea was to make a real abandoned looking road using some plaster which I spread all over the area. I gave this a black base and then added the yellow stripes to the road. When I lifted up the masks, I saw that a lot of the black paint was lifting up, but I thought this would be okay because it is an abandoned road after all. For the sidewalk, I decided to cut a few styrene squares to simulate concrete blocks. These were chipped and scratched up to make them look neglected and abandoned. I glued these onto the areas where the building was going to be and gave them a grey base coat. I measured off where I wanted to put the street lamps and cut small circles out in these areas so that they could be fitted in carefully. Unfortunately, the more I worked with the diorama, the more I noticed that the plaster was coming loose and chipping and breaking off all over the place. So I decided to give that up as a bad job and removed all of the plaster and sanded everything down back to the foam board. This time I used some white glue and some tile grout to simulate the roads, and this worked a lot better. I gave the whole road a grey base coat and applied some white paint to the areas where the stop signs would be. I measured off the roads very carefully, especially the positioning for the vinyl letters which were going to spell out the word stop. The vinyl letters were all placed carefully, and I tried to make sure that everything was positioned correctly. I added another coat of white paint over these letters to minimize the bleeding of paint underneath the vinyl letters. Using a sponge, I applied various shades of grey to the road to give it a natural mottled type of look. Once this paint had dried, I gave it a dark wash with some Nuln oil to bring out the texture in the road. I used this same wash on the tiles to dirty them up a bit and make them look more decrepit. I carefully removed the vinyl lettering and was glad to see that even though there was a bit of paint that bled through, the words were still very readable. I masked off the various lines of the road and sponged on the yellow center line and the white lines from the stop street. Once this was dried, I applied a small amount of wash to the markings to make them blend in with the road, and the road was pretty much done. I thread the wiring of the street lights through to the bottom of the base and glued them in using some hot glue. Once these had dried, I glued the walls of the building onto the tiles and passed their electrical wiring to the base of the diorama through a small hole hidden in the back. I did the same with the motorcycle and the SWAT truck, passing all the wires to the bottom of the base. At this point it was time to do the 80 tiny sketch. I coded the sketch and uploaded it to an Arduino Uno. I tested everything to make sure that it was working correctly. I wanted the machine guns to operate independently and also had a small vignette of a zombie being electrocuted on the side of the building. In order to run all three of these effects, I coded a sketch which used 3 state machines to control all 3 effects. I've included a link to the sketch in the description below if you want to take a look at it. After checking on the Arduino Uno that the sketch was running properly, I programmed the sketch onto an 80 tiny chip. I soldered the 80 tiny to a small circuit board and connected up all the different wires for the effects. The initial idea was to have one of the building lights flash off every time the zombie received a zap of electricity. But because I was running it off of a 3-volt battery supply, this light was being affected by the machine gun fire as well, so I decided to leave that off at the last minute. I also painted up a few planks and some barrels just to add a few more elements of realism to the diorama. All of the electronics were connected up and positioned at the bottom of the base. I used some scattered terrain to simulate old leaves which were blowing all over the place. And I added, of course, the zombies. They were all placed in their designated positions and received some last touch-ups of paint. Then the diorama was pretty much done. Finally, I had a fun scene which I was very happy with. There was a lot of action and a lot of small areas of interest on the diorama. Thank you so much for watching our video. I hope you enjoyed the build journey and liked the way that it turned out. Please hit the like button and feel free to subscribe if you enjoy our content. Leave a comment below and tell us all about your exciting model builds. As always, we love to hear from you. Be good to yourself and happy modeling.